I'm Mrs. Murdock, and today we are going to be going over carbohydrates and lipids. So carbohydrates and lipids are at the top of your graphic organizer over here. And we're going to use the graphic organizer to help us organize our knowledge about them a little bit. So let's start with the elements that make up carbohydrates. Maybe you can remember, what kind of elements, atoms, do you find in a carbohydrate? Do you remember? Does this remind you? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Exactly right. Okay, so CHO, right? Okay, and carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are found in a particular ratio in carbohydrates. So 1 to 2 to 1 is the ratio in a carbohydrate. That means that there's always going to be twice as much hydrogen as there is carbon in a carbohydrate, or twice as much hydrogen as there is oxygen in a carbohydrate. So maybe you remember that one of the most famous examples of a carbohydrate is glucose, right? And this is actually the structural formula of glucose. And if you counted the number of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens in this structure, you would find, and I know you remember this formula, that you would find that there are 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens in this picture. You would find that many of each one of them. And if you look at those numbers, you can see that there are twice as many hydrogens as there are carbons. Can you see that? 12 hydrogens, 6 carbons, 1 to 2 ratio, right? Same with the oxygen. 6, 12, 6 is the same ratio as 1 to 1. If you divided all those numbers by 6, you would get 1 and 2 and 1, right? Okay, so let's go to monomers. The types of monomers in a carbohydrate from the pear deck the other day. Every monomer usually starts with the word mono, and then in the carbohydrate case, it's saccharides. Okay. So monosaccharides, I would have written it as one word, but I didn't quite have room. Okay. Monosaccharides are the monomers, or the building blocks of carbohydrates. One of the famous examples of a monomer is glucose, right? But there are others too, small sugars. The function of most carbohydrates is for quick energy for cells. Quick energy for the most part. Okay. You guys seeing all right? Everybody good? All right. Okay. So quick energy, glucose will give you quick energy. Starch will give you quick energy. These are easily digested sugars and carbohydrates that will allow your muscles to work really fast if they need to, will allow your brain to send signals, all the things that your body needs to do. And in fact, your body will always go to the carbohydrates first to get energy. That's their preference. The preference of your body is to go to carbohydrates first. But there also is an exception that I will write down. There is one carbohydrate that isn't very easily digestible, and it's called cellulose. Cellulose is a carbohydrate that's not good for energy because it's hard to digest, and you find it in cell walls. It builds cell walls, which you might remember way back in your memory is a structure that's only in plant cells, and it's a rigid structure around cells in plant cells, and we'll learn that in the cell unit later. So cellulose, not good for quick energy, but it is really good for keeping cell walls, keeping plant cells in good shape. Okay, I'm going to go all the way over to the other side to finish up here. Here we go. All right. So examples of carbohydrates, obviously glucose, one of the smallest ones, and fructose. Those are both monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, the smallest ones, the basic ones. And then slightly bigger is a disaccharide, which you remember called sucrose. We talked about sucrose, which is a disaccharide. So these are monosaccharides. This is a disaccharide made of a glucose and a fructose bound together. So two monosaccharides together make sucrose. Yeah? Sure, yes. Yes. Okay. All right. And then even bigger are polysaccharides like glycogen and starch. And those are polysaccharides, which are repeating many units of many monosaccharides in a row. They're really big molecules. And glycogen is the one that is found in animal muscle. So in your muscles, you have this molecule called glycogen that stores a whole bunch of glucoses in it. And then if you need that sugar, if like your body gets in trouble, if like a bear is chasing you, or if you're really hungry, you haven't eaten in a while, your body will go to your muscles and tell it to break down that glycogen into glucose and flood your bloodstream with glucose, which is much easier for the body to use as energy. Okay. All right, everybody good with carbohydrates? Good. All right, so that was a good review. Now let's go to lipids, because we've also learned about them. And it's good to do lipids with carbohydrates because they actually have the same elements in them. Lipids also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it is not the same ratio. They have lots of carbon, they have lots of hydrogen, but very little of this. Very little oxygen. They do have some, but not very much. Not very much at all. So that does make them different from the carbohydrates. Lipids are mostly used for long-term energy storage. Long-term energy storage. So when your body needs energy, it's going to go to the carbs first. And then if it runs out of carbs and there aren't any more carbs, to use, it'll go to your fat layers next. So how many of you have ever been on a diet before? Yeah, and a lot of times, a lot of diets, what they do is, we've all done it. We've all done it. Okay, so one of the common things in a diet is to cut your carbohydrate down in your diet, right? To eat less carbohydrates, less pasta and potatoes and things like that, and more things like salads and fruit and other things that have less carbohydrates in them. And what that does is it forces your body, oh, there's no carbohydrates here, so I'm just going to go for the fats instead. It forces your body to go to those lipid layers that you want to get rid of. And that's one strategy in dieting, and that's why that works. Because you're tricking your body. You're saying, well, I'm taking away the carbs, you have to go to the fats and get rid of the fats, right? Okay. So long-term energy storage is what most fats do, but there is an exception. A couple of exceptions. Except, remember phospholipids? We talked about them. Phospholipids is not for energy storage. It actually builds what? Where do you find phospholipids? Builds cell, membranes. It builds cell membranes. Now remember, membranes are different from walls. You find cell walls in plant cells, and those are very rigid, very different. But cell membranes, all cells have those, so they're really, really important for building all the cell membranes. When we get to the cell unit in a couple weeks, we'll talk a lot about phospholipids. So phospholipids is one exception, and the other exception is something called steroids. Remember, Mr. Bouchard had so much fun talking about those, right? So steroids, some of them act as hormones, right? Like testosterone. Testosterone is a hormone, and it is actually in the lipid group. And so is cholesterol. And they're not for energy. They're not going, you're not going to go to phospholipids or testosterone or cholesterol to get energy for your body to do stuff. They are for building things or for signaling things to happen that are important. So the monomers of fats, I'll put that here. There are two. A glycerol is one of the building subunits, and the other parts of fats that you find are called fatty acids. Okay, so we're almost done with this. Let's go over here. Let me just move myself over here. There we go. All right. So here's a molecule that is actually a fat molecule. This whole thing is a fat molecule. And if you look at this fat molecule, do you think you'd find this in like animal fat, or would it be plant fat like an oil? What do you think? Looking at these chains here, because we learned this the other day. See how straight those chains are? Is that going to be a solid or a liquid at room temperature? Yes, solid. So then animal or plant? Animal, yeah, because remember I said if we had oil in us, we'd all be sloshing around like barbapapas, right? Okay. So this is actually an animal fat. But there are other examples here. So we have fats that are an example of lipids. We have phospholipids are another example, which we said over there. And we have steroids. And those are the three main examples that you'll need to know, okay? So fats, phospholipids, and steroids are the three main examples that you have in the lipid group. Everybody good? All right. Thank you for your attention. I hope that was helpful.